My son tried to poison me and take 4 time. But I left a recording that could ruin them both. The bitter taste on my tongue told me something was wrong long before my body began to shake. Yet the glass was still warm in my hand, because it came from my own son. I walked to the sink, steadying myself, thinking of how many times I had trusted him, with more than just my money. He thought the $4.5 million I earned in a lifetime was already his. What he did not know was that every word he whispered in this house could be heard again, recorded, waiting. I had been silent for too many years, but that night, my silence started working against him. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you are listening in the comments. Subscribe if you believe it is never too late to take back your life. The mornings in Annapolis had a certain rhythm to them. You could hear the hollow knock of sailboat masts against their lines before you even opened the door. The air carried that sharp, salty smell from the bay, mixed with the damp scent of wood that had seen too many winters. I liked to start my day in the kitchen, letting the kettle heat while I read the paper. Tea, not coffee. Coffee got my hands shaking, and I needed my hands steady for the small routines that kept me anchored. That morning, the headlines were about the latest political debate in Washington and a storm forming far out in the Atlantic. The storm was still just a swirl on a weather map, but the broadcasters already had their voices tuned for urgency. At 74, I had seen enough hurricane seasons to know that the ones you don't respect tend to be the ones that leave you in the dark. Still, storms were part of life here. The real trouble often came from much closer. I was halfway through the crossword when my phone rang. Evan's name lit the screen. My only son. He didn't usually call this early unless there was something he wanted to talk about before I could get busy with the day. I answered and he told me he was stopping by. Said there was some paperwork he needed me to sign. A small thing, nothing to worry about. That was how he put it. With Evan, small things sometimes turned into large things, especially when they involved money. I told him the front door was unlocked. 15 minutes later, I heard his car in the driveway. He came in with that same brisk energy he had since he was a teenager, only now it was shaped by tailored jackets and cologne. He kissed my cheek and dropped a leather folder on the table. I set my teacup aside and watched him fuss with his phone for a moment before sitting down. He asked if I had checked my generator lately. I told him I had. I also told him I had a set of emergency radios from the community response team. He gave me that smile of his, the one that said he appreciated my foresight but still thought I could use his help. Then he slid the folder toward me. Inside were forms titled Temporary Power of Attorney and Emergency Contact Update. He explained it would just give him the ability to handle bills, insurance, and property matters in case a storm knocked out communications for a while. He kept his tone casual, as if it was no more important than updating a grocery list. I glanced over the papers, feeling the weight of them more than the actual pages. I told him I would look them over. I didn't say yes, and I didn't say no. Evan had learned early that silence could be a type of resistance from me, though he never seemed to accept it as final. He asked if I wanted to have dinner later that evening. I said yes, and he suggested the seafood place by the bay. He knew I liked their grilled salmon. I suspected he liked it because it was one of the few restaurants in town where everyone seemed to know him. After he left, the house felt quieter than before. I put the folder on the counter, not in the desk where I kept important documents. My eyes landed on a small digital recorder in the kitchen drawer, a gift from my neighbor Martin, who used to be a journalist. He had told me I should use it to jot down ideas or record the stories I liked to tell. I had never used it for anything serious, but I kept it charged. I took it out and held it for a moment, thinking about his advice. Sometimes a simple record of words could be stronger than a stack of paper. The afternoon slipped by with the hum of distant boats coming in and out of the harbor. I checked the weather again. The storm had shifted slightly, moving faster toward the coast. It was still days away, but the air already felt thicker. I thought about the papers in the folder. In a real emergency, those forms might be useful. But I also knew that giving someone legal control over what you own was like handing them the keys to your entire life. Once you did it, there was no taking it back quietly. Just before sunset, I stepped outside onto the back porch. The light over the water had turned gold, and the first cool gusts of the season came off the bay. It reminded me of all the times I had stood in this very spot, waiting for my husband to return from a trip or for Evan to come home from school. The years had gone quickly. You don't notice how much changes until you look back at the person you used to be and realize she would barely recognize the life you have now. When the porch light flickered, I went inside and filled the kettle again. I set the recorder on the kitchen table. It sat there, small and unassuming, but I knew that if I ever needed it, it could hold more power than anything in Evan's folder. Outside, the wind picked up. The masts in the harbor tapped against their lines again, faster this time, as if reminding me that storms rarely give you time to prepare once they arrive. I poured my tea, sat down at the table, and let the sound of the wind settle in my mind. Something was coming. I just didn't know if it would be from the ocean or from inside my own family. The seafood place by the bay was crowded enough to drown out most conversations, but quiet enough that you could hear the water lap against the docks if you paid attention. I arrived first. The hostess knew me by name, led me to a corner table where I could see both the entrance and the boats outside. It was a habit I had picked up over the years, choosing a seat that gave me the best view of everything without making it obvious. Tara was already there. She had a way of arriving early, as if to set the tone before anyone else walked in. Her hair was loose around her shoulders, and she wore a soft gray sweater that matched the overcast sky outside. She smiled warmly when she saw me, stood, and gave me a quick embrace. Her perfume was light, nothing cloying, but it lingered just long enough to remind you she had been there. Evan came in a moment later, apologizing for a phone call he had to finish outside. He slid into the seat beside Tara, placing his phone face down on the table. The waitress brought menus, but we all knew what I would order. I said I would take the grilled salmon with roasted vegetables. Evan ordered the same. Tara chose a salad, but asked for a side of baked crab dip. It was the kind of detail she knew would make conversation later, something to talk about in that effortless, social way she had. We talked about the weather first. The storm offshore was gaining strength, moving faster than expected. Tara mentioned her concern about power outages, the risk of spoiled food, the hassle of finding ice when everyone else was looking for it too. Evan nodded, but kept circling back to the idea of being prepared in every way. He mentioned the forms again, lightly, as if slipping them into the conversation without putting weight on them. He said it would be easier if things were in place ahead of time. I let him talk, keeping my eyes on the silverware as I adjusted it on the napkin. When the food came, the salmon was perfect, the edges crisp from the grill, the inside tender. The scent of lemon and dill rose with the steam. I took my time with it. Across the table, Tara poured herself a glass of white wine and offered some to me. I took a sip. It had a bright, clean flavor, but underneath it was something faintly metallic, something that didn't belong. I set the glass down, slow enough not to draw attention, and reached for my water. Tara was talking about a fundraiser she was helping organize for a veterans housing project. She had a way of weaving her words so that her generosity sounded natural, never staged. She described the guest list, the location, and the silent auction items. Evan listened, but kept glancing at me, waiting for the right moment to slide the conversation back to the papers in the folder. I could feel his focus, like a steady pressure in the room. I asked about their work instead. Evan said the real estate market was shifting, that interest rates were making buyers nervous. He had a project in motion, something tied to the waterfront that could be big if the timing worked out. Tara added that they were working with people who could make the process smooth, people with influence. She didn't elaborate, but the way she said it told me she was proud of those connections. Halfway through the meal, Evan leaned in a little closer and said he just wanted to make sure I would be taken care of if the storm hit hard. His voice was steady, and his eyes stayed on mine. It sounded like concern, but there was an undercurrent I had learned to notice over the years. Care and control can share the same tone if you are not careful. I thanked him for thinking of me and said I would keep the forms in mind. That seemed to satisfy him for now. The rest of the meal was filled with lighter topics. Tara talked about a new restaurant opening downtown. Evan about a friend who had just bought a boat. I nodded, smiled where it felt right, and let the conversation drift. When we finished, Evan went to pay the bill. Tara and I stood by the window, watching the lights on the dock reflect off the dark water. She turned to me and said in a quiet, even voice that people have the right to choose the kind of peace they want at any age. Her eyes held mine just long enough to make the words settle. I told her that was true, and she smiled, a small curve of her mouth before turning back to the window. Outside, the wind had picked up, carrying the smell of salt and something heavier, the kind of air that says a change is coming. I walked to my car, feeling the faint chill settle into my hands. Driving home, the roads were nearly empty. Streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement. The folder on my kitchen counter waited where I had left it, untouched. I set my bag down, glanced at the small recorder on the table, and turned on the radio for the storm update. The voice on the broadcast said the system was still days away, but moving steadily closer. I made a note in my mind to check the batteries in the flashlights and the gas in the generator. I also made a note about the wine. The morning after dinner at the bay was heavy with the kind of air that makes you notice you're breathing. The storm out in the Atlantic had grown stronger overnight, and the news anchors spoke in that measured cadence they use when they want you to pay attention without panicking. I set the radio on low while I made breakfast, listening as they talked about wind speeds and possible track changes. The word landfall came up more than once. I had already planned to join the community emergency team for the morning drill at the shelter. We met in the high school gym, where rows of folding tables were set up with first aid kits, flashlights, and boxes of bottled water. I helped a friend secure a splint during the first aid refresher, then checked the contents of the radio bin. People were in good spirits, but you could feel that quiet edge in the room, the understanding that this might not just be a drill in a few days. Martin was there, wearing the same navy windbreaker I had seen him in for years. On our way out, he asked how dinner had gone. I told him it was fine. He raised his eyebrows slightly, but didn't press. I mentioned the wine and how it had tasted off. He paused, then reminded me that Maryland law allowed for one-party consent in recording conversations. His voice was low, even, the way you speak when you want someone to hear every word without the distraction of emotion. He suggested that if I ever felt uncertain again, I should keep a record. Information, he said, is best gathered quietly and stored carefully. By the time I got home, clouds were thickening over the bay. I checked the weather updates again, then glanced at the camera feed from my front door. There was a clip from the night before. It showed Evan walking a man to the driveway after leaving my house. The figure was partly turned away from the camera, but the detail that caught my eye was the tie clip glinting in the porch light. It had a small emblem shaped like a boat dock. It was nothing I recognized from Evan's usual business circle. The rest of the afternoon, I kept to small tasks, making sure the generator was fueled, checking the pantry, charging spare batteries. In the back of my mind, the image of that tie clip stayed. It was a reminder that there were parts of Evan's life I hadn't been invited into, and lately those parts seemed to be growing. Later that evening, the wind picked up, rattling the windows in their frames. I had just finished tidying the kitchen when the sound of tires on gravel came up the driveway. Evan stepped in carrying a plastic bag with medical supplies. He said he had been at the pharmacy and thought I might want extras on hand. We sat in the kitchen while the rain started to tap against the roof. He asked again about the forms, saying it would be smart to have them ready in case the storm caused damage or delays in communication. I told him I would think about it. He nodded but lingered on the subject longer than necessary, circling it the way a fisherman circles a good spot before casting a line. I changed the subject, asking about his work. He spoke about a waterfront project, how permits were hard to get, but worth the effort if you had the right people involved. His tone carried a kind of confidence that comes from having pieces in motion. But there was also an impatience there, like someone waiting for a door to open that he couldn't push himself. After he left, I walked through the quiet house, checking that the doors were locked. I paused at the staircase, running my hand along the smooth wood of the banister. The house felt steady, but storms have a way of testing things you take for granted. I went into the bedroom and opened the drawer where the small recorder sat. Martin's words echoed in my mind. Quietly and carefully, I set it on the nightstand, then took another device from the kitchen drawer and placed it in the cabinet near the dining room. It was a small step, but it felt like drawing a line, one that no one else could see. The wind outside was stronger now, bending the trees along the water. I closed the blinds and poured a glass of water, thinking of the tie clip again, the way it had caught the light for just a second. I didn't know who the man was, but I knew that nothing about Evan's life was ever without purpose. That kind of meeting didn't happen without a reason, and reasons often had a way of showing themselves if you were patient enough to wait. I went to bed with the radio on low, the voice of the forecaster fading in and out with the signal. Sleep came in light waves, the kind where you wake often enough to keep track of the hours. Each time I stirred, I could hear the wind at the edges of the house, steady and growing. Somewhere in that restless night, I decided that whatever this storm brought, I needed to be ready for more than just the weather. By late afternoon, the wind had a restless edge to it, brushing against the windows in short, sharp bursts. The bay was darker than usual, its surface rippling under a low, steel-colored sky. The radio kept repeating the same track projection for the storm, but with each update the timing shifted closer. I checked the batteries in the flashlights again and moved a few things away from the windows. The house felt prepared, but I could not shake the sense that I was waiting for something else entirely. The power flickered once just after sunset. The lamps dimmed, came back, then steadied. I lit a candle on the kitchen counter anyway. The air had that quiet, hollow quality storm, as if the world was holding its breath. I put on a sweater and was about to settle with a book when I heard a faint creak from upstairs. It could have been the wind or the house adjusting, but it was not in rhythm with the weather outside. I moved toward the staircase, careful on each step. Halfway up, another sound came from my study. It was softer this time, like paper being shifted or a drawer sliding closed. I reached the top of the stairs and saw that the door was open. My study door is never left open. Inside, the light from the hallway spilled across the floor. The desk drawer that held my personal files was half open. Before I could speak, a figure moved out from behind it. Evan stood there, one hand still on the drawer, the other holding a folder he had no reason to touch. His face was unreadable, the kind of stillness that comes when someone has already decided what they are about to do. I stepped forward, and that was when it happened. A sharp, unexpected push to my shoulder threw my balance off. My foot caught the edge of the top step. For a split second, I tried to grab the railing, but my hand slid against the polished wood. The world tilted, and the sound of my body hitting each step filled the stairwell. I landed hard at the bottom, the back of my head striking the floor, the shock radiating through my ribs. The pain came fast, hot, and deep, making it hard to draw a full breath. Through the haze, I saw Evan coming down the stairs. His voice was calm, telling me I must have lost my footing. He bent over me, but his eyes flicked toward the study door upstairs before meeting mine again. I could smell the faint trace of his cologne, and underneath it, something metallic from the drawer he had been touching. The next thing I remember clearly was the glare of hospital lights. A nurse was adjusting a monitor by my bed. My ribs burned each time I inhaled, and my head felt heavy, stitched tight where it had struck the floor. Evan sat in a chair near the wall, his jacket folded neatly over his lap. He told me the doctor said I had a mild concussion and 2 cracked ribs. He added that I was lucky it was not worse. His tone was even, as if he had rehearsed it. Tara appeared in the doorway not long after, holding a paper cup of coffee. She stepped in with a look of concern that fit perfectly on her face. She asked if I was in much pain, then quickly shifted to saying they could stay at the house with me for a while to help. Her words were smooth, suggesting it would be easier for everyone if I rested and let them handle things. She mentioned the storm again, how dangerous it would be for me alone if the power went out. I listened without responding, focusing instead on the pulse of pain along my ribs. The doctor came in to explain my injuries, speaking over the rhythmic beeping of the monitor. He said I could go home the next day if I was careful. He advised against bending, lifting, or climbing stairs for a while. Evan nodded in agreement before I could say anything. Back at the house the following evening, I moved slowly, every step sending a reminder through my side. Evan carried my overnight bag upstairs while Tara unpacked groceries in the kitchen. I told them I needed to rest early. When they were both in the kitchen, I checked the small recorder Martin had helped me place in the outlet near the stairs. The tiny light was still blinking, steady and quiet, almost hidden in the shadow of the wall. I left it there, knowing it had been running through the storm's first night and everything that came with it. Upstairs, I closed my bedroom door and sat on the edge of the bed. The house felt different now. The familiar walls no longer carried the same sense of safety they once did. Every creak and shift seemed sharper, more deliberate. Outside, the wind was building again, rattling the branches against the roof. I lay back, careful not to twist, and let the sound of the approaching storm fill the room. Somewhere in the dark, beyond the weather, I could feel the next move forming. The ride home from the hospital was quiet. Evan kept his eyes on the road, both hands on the wheel, while Tara sat beside me in the back seat, speaking softly about simple things. She mentioned that she had stocked the fridge with easy meals and left a basket of snacks by the couch. Her voice was careful, measured, like someone keeping a fragile object from tipping. I thanked her without looking away from the window. The rain had slowed to a mist, the streets shining under the low gray sky. When we reached the driveway, Evan helped me out of the car. His grip was firm, almost too firm for my bruised ribs. Inside, I lowered myself onto the couch and let them move around me, putting away groceries, tidying things that didn't need tidying. The sound of cabinets opening and closing filled the room. They were making themselves at home in a way that felt more permanent than helpful. I told them I needed rest, and they finally went upstairs to the guest room. Once I was alone, I scanned the room without moving much. The recorder hidden near the baseboard in the kitchen outlet was still in place. That small, blinking light was a quiet reassurance. I shifted my gaze to the folder on the counter. It was the same one Evan had pushed toward me days earlier. It remained closed, but its presence was a constant reminder of what he wanted. The first night back, I kept the television on low in the living room. It covered the softer sounds from upstairs, the muffled footsteps and the occasional creak of the floorboards. I lay still, keeping my breathing slow and steady. In the early hours, I heard Tara's voice in the kitchen, speaking in a hushed tone. The cadence told me she was on the phone. I could not make out the words, but I recognized the careful pauses of someone taking instructions. The following morning, they were all kind again. Evan offered to handle my bills for the week. Tara suggested she could sort through some of my paperwork to make sure insurance information was updated. I nodded without committing. My ribs still ached, and I let them believe my silence was from pain, not choice. The truth was, I wanted them comfortable enough to stop watching themselves so closely. Later that afternoon, Martin came by under the pretense of dropping off some soup. He stood at the door just long enough to ask if I was managing. I told him I was, and that I had kept the devices running. His eyes held mine for a moment, and then he left without stepping inside. He knew better than to linger. That evening, I moved slowly through the house, noting what had been touched. A photo frame in the hallway was slightly crooked. The drawer in the small desk by the window was left open by an inch. It was not much, but enough to confirm they were looking for something. I thought about the USB drive I had seen in Evan's bag once, the one Tara had mentioned using for work files. If they were searching, then they believed I had something worth finding. Before bed, I placed a second recorder in the cabinet under the sink, where its small microphone would catch voices in the kitchen. I also started keeping a notepad in my robe pocket, jotting down times when I noticed movement, conversations, or small changes around the house. My handwriting was slow and deliberate, but the notes were clear. If I was going to build a picture, I wanted it to be complete. The weather worsened as the night went on. Wind scraped against the siding, and the first heavy drops of rain began to fall. Upstairs, Evan and Tara stayed in their room longer than usual. Just after midnight, I heard the soft tread of footsteps coming down the stairs. I kept my eyes closed as Tara passed by the couch. The faint scent of her perfume lingered in the air, followed by the click of a cabinet opening in the kitchen. A moment later, she was gone again. I waited until the house was still before reaching for the notepad. The entry was short but specific. 12:07 a.m. Tara in kitchen. Cabinet opened. I slid the notepad back under the blanket and let the sound of the rain mask my thoughts. The next day, Evan suggested we review my emergency documents together. I told him I would need more time, that the pain made it hard to focus. He gave a polite smile, but I could see the flicker of impatience in his eyes. Tara busied herself making tea, her movements quick and efficient. They both stayed close for most of the day, which made me even more certain they were waiting for a moment when I would lower my guard. By the time evening came, the storm outside had fully settled over the bay. The lamps swayed on the porch, their chains clicking in the wind. I sat in the armchair, my notepad in my lap, the small recorder near the stairs still blinking. The house felt like it was holding two separate conversations, one in the open and one in the shadows. I was listening to both. It started in the middle of the afternoon, a sudden flicker in the lights that made the whole house feel like it had inhaled sharply. I was in the living room, my notepad open, jotting down the time. Outside, the sky had turned an unsettling shade of greenish gray, the kind of color that made you think of sirens and weather warnings. Then the power cut out completely, and the only sound left was the hum of the wind pressing against the windows. I stayed still for a moment, letting my eyes adjust. Somewhere upstairs, a door opened and shut. The creak of the staircase followed, slow and deliberate. Evan appeared in the dim light, his face shadowed, but his voice overly casual as he said he was going to check the breaker. Tara stayed in the kitchen, moving quietly. I could hear the faint clink of glass. Without electricity, the house felt smaller, as if the walls had moved in. I reached for the flashlight I kept tucked between the couch cushions and turned it on, sweeping the beam briefly toward the kitchen. Tara's hands were busy over the counter. She froze when the light crossed her face, then smiled too quickly, asking if I needed water. I told her no, letting my voice carry just enough warmth to keep her comfortable. The recorder in the kitchen was battery-powered, something Martin had insisted on when we set it up. I reminded myself of that as I sat back in the chair. The devices were still working even if the rest of the house wasn't. That thought steadied me. The wind outside picked up, rattling the loose pane in the back door. Evan returned after several minutes, saying the outage was neighborhood-wide and that it might be hours before power came back. His tone was almost cheerful, like someone trying to make the best of an inconvenience. But I caught the glance he shared with Tara, brief and unreadable. We lit a few candles, placing them on the coffee table and by the hallway. Their glow softened the edges of the room, but it also made shadows deeper. I noticed Evan drifting near my desk in the corner, running his hand along the surface as though he were simply steadying himself. When he leaned toward the drawer, I spoke up, asking if he could bring me another blanket from the closet. He hesitated, then nodded and walked away. The storm outside intensified. Rain slapped against the siding, and the trees groaned under the weight of the wind. Every so often, a low rumble rolled through, shaking the floorboards just enough to be felt in the soles of my feet. Tara sat across from me, sipping tea she had made on the gas stove. She didn't meet my eyes often, preferring to watch the flicker of the candle. After a while, Evan suggested we all stay in the same room for warmth. I agreed, even smiled faintly, but my mind was on the recorder tucked beneath the sink in the kitchen. The candlelight wouldn't hide the microphone, but its size and placement meant they would never think to look for it. If they thought I was resting, they might speak more freely. Near dusk, the storm seemed to shift, its rhythm changing from relentless to uneven bursts. That was when they made their move. I had stepped into the hallway, pretending to adjust a coat on the rack, when I heard Evan's voice low and urgent. Tara responded in a whisper, but the words carried enough to reach me. They spoke about the documents again, about needing to finalize things before the end of the month. Evan mentioned the bank. Tara mentioned my medication, her tone sharper this time. There was a pause, then a sound I recognized from the kitchen cabinet door. My chest tightened. I eased back toward the living room without making a sound. By the time they returned to me, their faces were calm, their voices easy. Evan said the wind was letting up. Tara asked if I wanted to play cards to pass the time. I agreed, though my focus was elsewhere. I was thinking about the recorder and what it might have captured in those minutes when I had been out of sight. The power returned just before nightfall, the sudden blaze of light almost startling after hours in the dim. Evan went to check the television, muttering about catching the evening news. Tara cleared the cups from the table, her movements quick but not hurried. They seemed relieved, as if the return of electricity had smoothed something between them. When they went upstairs later, I moved into the kitchen with measured steps. I didn't touch the recorder, just glanced at the small device, its light steady. Everything was still in place. I exhaled slowly, letting the sound blend with the hum of the refrigerator now back to life. The blackout had given me something I couldn't have forced. A moment when they felt unseen. A moment when their real voices slipped through the polite veneer. And I knew, without a doubt, that whatever came next would hinge on what those few minutes had caught. The next morning, the house was unnervingly still. Evan had already left for work, and Tara had gone to her volunteer shift at the community center. I waited a full 20 minutes after the sound of her car pulling away before I moved toward the kitchen. My slippers made almost no noise on the tile, but I still found myself holding my breath as I reached beneath the sink. The recorder sat exactly where I had left it, its small indicator light still glowing. I picked it up, slipped into the pantry, and shut the door behind me. The air smelled faintly of dried herbs and cardboard boxes, and the narrow space muffled the outside world. I pressed play. At first, all I heard was the hum of the storm and the occasional clink of a cup being set down. Then Evan's voice, low and quick, cut through. He spoke about timelines, about how everything had to be finalized before the month ended. His tone carried a weight I had heard before, the kind he used when closing a deal. Tara's reply was sharper. She mentioned the medication again, her voice tightening around the words. There was a pause, and I could almost picture the look they exchanged. Then came the sound of the kitchen cabinet door and the rustle of paper. I let it play twice, each time catching something new. A change in pitch, a hesitation, the way they spoke as if they were certain I couldn't hear them. When I stopped the recording, my hands were steady, but my chest felt heavy. This wasn't suspicious anymore. This was proof. Proof they were discussing my finances, my health, and their plans in the same breath. I tucked the recorder into my cardigan pocket and walked to my desk. The lockbox sat there, its key resting in the ceramic bowl beside it. Inside were the property deeds, bank statements, and the legal documents Martin and I had kept meticulously organized. I opened the box and stared at the neat rows of envelopes. These were more than papers. They were the levers of control over everything I owned. That day, I made 2 phone calls. The first was to my attorney, explaining I needed to update my will and have a private discussion about asset protection. She agreed to meet me in her office later in the week. The second was to the local bank, requesting an appointment to review and possibly move certain funds. I kept both conversations brief, polite, and without detail, knowing that every word spoken in this house could be overheard. When Tara returned in the afternoon, she seemed lighter, almost cheerful. She brought me a salad from the cafe, chatting about people she'd seen at the community center. I thanked her, listening carefully for any undercurrent in her voice. Evan came home later, a little flushed from the wind outside, and asked if the power had stayed on all day. I smiled and told him it had. We spent the evening in the living room. They talked about an upcoming charity auction, about neighbors they hadn't seen in months, but I could feel their attention flicker toward me from time to time, as if gauging my mood. I kept my posture relaxed, my voice measured, and my eyes on the television, while inside I was cataloging every detail. Before bed, I returned the recorder to its place in the kitchen. Let them believe nothing had changed. Let them feel safe enough to keep talking. The storm had passed outside, but here, inside these walls, it had only just begun. 2 days later, I sat in my attorney's office with the blinds drawn against the afternoon glare. Her desk was neat, except for the stack of folders between us. She had already skimmed the notes I brought and now looked at me in the way she always did, when something serious was unfolding, steady, patient, and without judgment. I told her I wanted every part of my estate reviewed, updated, and, where possible, shielded. I spoke plainly, without giving away the full truth about Evan and Tara, though she caught enough in my tone to understand this was about more than just paperwork. We went over the deeds first, moving certain titles into a trust only I could dissolve. Then the bank accounts, shifting a portion into a separate branch where I knew neither of them had connections. Every signature I placed on the documents felt like a step away from danger. like quietly pulling bricks out of the wall they thought was closing in on me. From there, I went directly to the bank. The manager, a kind man who had known Martin, greeted me warmly. I explained I wanted to make adjustments to my accounts, spreading the funds in a way that would make them less accessible without my approval. He didn't pry, just nodded and handled the arrangements with the discretion I needed. Walking out into the crisp air, I felt the faintest lift in my chest, as if a weight had shifted, though not yet gone. That evening, I returned home before Evan and Tara. I walked through the room slowly, studying them as if I were a guest. I noticed little changes. The silver frame with my wedding picture now placed slightly behind a newer photo of the three of us at a barbecue. The cookbook with Martin's handwriting tucked a shelf lower. Small, almost invisible acts. But I saw them. I had lived in this house long enough to recognize when something was being quietly erased. Over dinner, I asked Evan about his work, letting him talk while I watched Tyra out of the corner of my eye. She kept glancing toward the kitchen, her expression sharpening whenever I shifted in my seat. I wondered if she had checked the cabinet that day, if she had noticed the recorder was exactly where she left it. Her composure told me nothing, but her silence was telling in its own way. Later, in my bedroom, I opened the drawer where I kept my old address book. I found the number for Martin's cousin, someone I hadn't spoken to in years. I called and left a warm message about wanting to reconnect. It wasn't just for sentiment. There was a part of me that needed to reestablish ties, to have voices outside this house who knew me, who could stand as witnesses if things turned darker. That night, I placed a second recorder in the hallway console table, right near where the phone sat. If they called anyone while I was out, I wanted to hear it. The first device would stay in the kitchen, catching their conversations there. The second would be my insurance, a net for anything that slipped through. When I finally went to bed, the house was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet now. Not the stillness of peace, but the pause before something shifts. I could feel it in the air, in the way their footsteps upstairs seemed measured, in the way the wind pressed against the windows. The game was still theirs in their minds, but the pieces were moving, and soon they would realize I had been moving mine all along. The next morning, I made sure to leave the house early. I told Evan I needed to pick up prescriptions and stop by the church pantry. I wanted them to believe I would be gone for hours. My purse was light, and my steps steady as I backed the car out of the driveway. But instead of heading into town, I circled around the block, parking 2 streets over where I could not be seen from the house. The air was cool and damp, the kind that carries sound farther than you'd expect. I sat with my hands wrapped around the steering wheel, counting the minutes until I thought it was safe. Then I walked back toward the house, keeping to the side yard, my shoes crunching softly against the gravel. From there, I slipped inside through the back door, silent as a shadow, and went straight to my room. The recorder in the hallway had been running since the night before. I pressed the stop button, replaced it with a fresh memory card, and tucked the device back exactly as it had been. My heart thudded in my chest, not from fear of being caught, but from the cold anticipation of hearing what had been said when they thought I was gone. That evening, after the house had settled into its usual rhythm, I sat at my desk with the recorder in my lap. The first few minutes were empty, just the faint hum of the refrigerator and the creak of the floorboards. Then, a voice. Tara's, sharp and low. She was speaking on the phone, her words clipped. I leaned closer, straining to catch every syllable. She told someone that things were moving slower than they hoped, that I was still sharper than I let on. She mentioned Evan by name, saying he needed to find another way if I kept resisting. My grip on the recorder tightened. She laughed once, a short, humorless sound, then lowered her voice further. She spoke about timing it and keeping her quiet until everything was in place. There was a pause, and then Evan's voice joined hers. He sounded impatient, almost frustrated, saying something about not wanting to wait through another holiday before it was done. They discussed papers, access, and at one point, Tara said she could handle it if Evan was too worried about being the one to act. I sat there for a long moment after the recording ended, the quiet of my room pressing in around me. It was one thing to suspect. It was another to hear the plotting in their own voices, stripped of any kindness, stripped of any blood tie. The air felt heavy, and yet there was a strange clarity in it. They were no longer just careless or greedy. They were deliberate, and they thought they had time. I decided they would not. The next day, I called my attorney again, asking her to prepare a set of documents that would further limit any access they might have to my affairs. I also arranged for a safety deposit box in a different bank. Into it, I placed a copy of the recordings, along with a sealed letter detailing events from the moment I first suspected foul play. The original stayed with me, hidden where I knew they would not look. That night, over dinner, I listened to them talk about everyday things. Tara complained about the grocery store being out of a certain wine. Evan discussed a project at work. But now, every glance between them, every pause, every measured word carried a weight I could read. They believed they were patient hunters. I knew they were walking toward a trap they could not see. I cleared the dishes, smiling faintly when Tara offered to help, then refused. In my mind, I was already setting the next step in motion. They would continue their quiet plotting, thinking I was simply fading into the background. But I was wide awake, every move calculated, every breath measured. And soon, they would understand the danger of underestimating a woman who had once kept an entire family together. The morning after I heard their voices on the recording, I moved through the house with a quiet purpose. The routine looked the same from the outside, but underneath, every action was deliberate. I brewed my coffee, tidied the kitchen, and folded the laundry, all while considering how to push them just enough to reveal themselves without forcing a direct confrontation too soon. They needed to believe they still had control. That afternoon, I placed a phone call within earshot of Tara, letting my voice carry just enough. I told the person on the other end that my attorney had advised me to review my estate plans and that she would be coming by later in the week to go over a few changes. I knew Tara's ears would sharpen at the mention of changes, though I didn't look her way. I simply carried on with the conversation, as if unaware of her presence. Later, I went into town and stopped at the florist, buying a bouquet of lilies and a small arrangement of roses. I took the long way home, giving them time to stew in whatever conversation they might be having. When I returned, Tara was in the kitchen. Her smile stretched too wide, her eyes too still. She asked about the flowers, and I told her they were for an old friend who had always loved lilies. I left it at that, letting her mind wander to whatever conclusion suited her. That night, I wrote in my journal, documenting everything: the call I made, her reaction, the sudden shift in her tone. I had learned over the years that small provocations could reveal more than direct accusations. People showed their true intentions when they thought someone was about to change the rules on them. The following day, I arranged to meet with my attorney at the house instead of her office. I made sure the meeting took place in the sunroom, with the doors open enough for voices to carry down the hall. We spoke plainly about setting up new safeguards, about ensuring that certain accounts and properties remained inaccessible to anyone but me. My attorney was discreet, but she understood the importance of letting certain words be overheard. It was a delicate balance, enough to stir the water, but not so much as to send them into hiding. After she left, the house felt different. Evan came home early, something he rarely did midweek. He lingered in the kitchen longer than usual, asking casual questions about my day, about whether I was feeling well, about the meeting. I answered in short, steady sentences, never offering more than he asked, watching the flicker of calculation in his eyes. That evening, I decided to set another layer of bait. I left an opened envelope on the desk in the study, with a visible letterhead from the bank. The paper inside was nothing more than a routine statement, but from a distance, it could easily be mistaken for something important. Then I waited. Before long, I heard the faint creak of the study door, the muffled shuffle of footsteps, and the quiet slide of paper against wood. I stayed in the kitchen, letting the sound travel to me like a whispered confession. The days that followed were a careful dance. I kept my steps slow, my voice calm, but I placed small, deliberate signs of change in their path. A new key on my ring, a locked drawer in the bedroom, an offhand mention of visiting an old friend in another town. Each one was a pebble in the water, sending ripples they could not ignore. By the end of the week, I could feel the tension in the air like the charge before a storm. They were watching me more closely now, speaking to each other in shorter bursts, their laughter forced and brittle. I had seen this kind of tightening before, in business, in family disputes, in the quiet wars that played out behind closed doors. It meant the moment was approaching when one side would make a move. I was ready. The recordings were secure, the documents in order, and my steps planned. They believed they were drawing me into their game. They had no idea I was the one who had set the board. It was a Thursday evening when the first real crack appeared, not in the privacy of our home, but out where others could see it. I had decided to attend a small fundraiser at the local community center, something I rarely did these days. It was for the library renovation, and I thought it would be a harmless outing. But I had another purpose. I wanted to see how they would behave when the eyes of the town were on us. I invited both Evan and Tara to join me, knowing neither of them enjoyed such events unless there was something in it for them. Evan hesitated at first, then agreed, no doubt calculating that it would be a good chance to be seen as the attentive son. Tara followed along with her usual bright smile, though I caught the faint hesitation before she answered. The room was warm with conversation and the faint scent of coffee and baked goods. I moved through it slowly, greeting old friends and neighbors, keeping my tone light, but my mind alert. Evan stayed close at first, hand on my elbow as if guiding me, but really it was to keep me within his reach. Tara drifted nearby, her eyes scanning the room with a watchful edge. It happened when a board member I had known for years asked me about my family. I smiled and said they were well, then added, in a casual tone, that I had been making some changes lately to ensure everything was organized for the future. I didn't elaborate, but the words were deliberate. I saw the way Evan's jaw tightened, the flicker in Tara's gaze before she glanced quickly away. A little later, one of the local bank managers approached me to say hello. We spoke briefly about a charity account I had set up years ago, and she mentioned she would call me soon to go over some updated paperwork. She meant nothing by it, but I felt the shift immediately. Evan's voice came in, smooth but edged, asking if I needed any help with those accounts, reminding me, loud enough for the table next to us, that he had handled things for me before. I kept my smile steady and told him it was all under control. By then, the tension was subtle but visible. Tara had moved to stand closer, her hand on Evan's arm, her smile stretched too far. They looked like a couple guarding a secret they didn't want exposed. Around us, the small talk carried on, but I could feel the undercurrent of their unease. After the speeches, I excused myself to the restroom, taking a longer route past the coat room where my small recorder was hidden in my purse. I didn't need to use it just yet, but I wanted to be sure it was ready. When I returned, Evan and Tara were speaking to a woman I knew from church, and though their faces were polite, the stiffness in their bodies told me they had been rattled. The drive home was quiet at first. Then, halfway down the road, Evan asked Gitthal why I had brought up making changes in front of so many people. His tone was calm on the surface, but there was a tightness underneath. I told him it was nothing more than estate tidying, the kind anyone my age would think about. Tara chimed in, saying they just wanted to make sure I didn't overwhelm myself. I let the words pass without challenge, my gaze fixed on the passing lights outside. Back at the house, I went straight to my room, closing the door behind me. I knew what I had done tonight. It wasn't just a test. It was a public nudge, a reminder that I was not as passive as they believed. I had given them a reason to worry that others might start asking questions, that their control was slipping. Lying in bed later, I thought about the way Evan's hand had gripped my elbow a little tighter than usual, about the way Tara had glanced at the floor when the bank manager spoke. Small tells, but tells nonetheless. The cracks were there now, thin but widening, and I would be ready when they split open completely. The morning of the town council meeting was colder than I expected for that time of year. I woke before dawn, letting the stillness settle over me as I dressed. Today was not a day for hesitation. Today was the day the truth would find its way into the open. I had chosen this meeting carefully. The council chamber was small but always drew a crowd, especially when budget discussions were on the agenda. Evan and Tara would be there, invited by me under the pretense of discussing a property donation in my name. They came because they believed they could still steer me, still keep me tethered. When I arrived, I took a seat near the front, my recorder tucked into my bag, not to capture more evidence, but to play what I had already collected. The chatter of the room softened when the council chair called the session to order. The early matters moved quickly, and then it was my turn to speak. I stepped up to the podium slowly, resting my hands lightly on the wood. My voice was calm, measured. I spoke about the importance of integrity, of protecting the vulnerable in our community. Faces around the room nodded. Then, without warning, I pressed a small button in my pocket, and Evan's voice filled the air. It was the recording from that night in my kitchen, the one where he spoke of accelerating my decline, of making sure the paperwork was ready before I could change my mind. Tara's voice followed, her tone cold and certain, urging him to act before I realized what they had done. The words hung in the chamber like smoke, heavy and undeniable. There was no outburst from them, not at first. Evan's face drained of color, his jaw tight as the whispers began to ripple through the room. Tara shifted in her chair, eyes darting toward the exit, but there was nowhere to go. The council chair looked stunned, then asked if I wished to continue. I told them only that I trusted the right people would take the next steps. I walked out before the meeting adjourned, the sound of murmurs following me down the hall. Outside, the air was sharp and bracing. I didn't look back, but I knew they weren't far behind. I could feel the weight of their stares pressing into my back. That night, I sat in my living room with the lights low, a cup of tea cooling in my hands. The phone rang twice before I unplugged it. Whatever came next, the investigations, the shifting opinions of neighbors, the unraveling of their carefully built facade, was no longer my burden to carry. I had placed it where it belonged. I thought about the years I had spent shrinking myself, making room for their ambitions, their comfort, their control. That woman is gone now. In her place was someone who had faced the worst kind of betrayal and found a way to stand taller because of it. The quiet in the house no longer felt empty. It felt earned. Sometimes the people you protect the most can become the ones you need to protect yourself from. If you have ever faced betrayal from someone you trusted deeply, you know the strength it takes to walk away with your head high. If you enjoyed this story, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment one below. If not, feel free to comment 0 so we know and can improve future videos. To hear the next story, click the box on the left. Thank you for watching.